All right. Hey, good morning. So let me tell you what's going on today and why you see four of us at this table. We decided that if we need to cancel service, which sadly it's maybe looking that way, that rather than all four of us do sermons individually for our church, since we sermon collab every week, it might be cooler just to sit down and kind of do a roundtable discussion. So for anyone that's watching that doesn't know who's at this table, I want to introduce everybody real quick. And then I'm just going to kind of moderate today, and we're going to talk through the passage. I'll read it in just a second, and then we'll ask some questions. So I'm Brian Smith. I'm a pastor at Christ Community Church in Ware. This is Don Raymond, a pastor at River of Grace Church in Concord. Elliot DeLorme, who is also a pastor at River of Grace Church in Concord, soon to be a pastor at the newly birthed Hope Church Henniker.
Yep,
sorry, I forgot to mention.
That's all right.
Hope Church Henniker, which is very soon in March. And then that's Jacob Young down there, pastor at King's Cross here where we are in Manchester. So I'm going to read the text and then we'll just jump right in. This is Philippians 2, verses 19 through the end of the chapter, verse 30. And I'm reading out of the CSB. Now I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be encouraged by news about you. For I have no one else like-minded who will genuinely care about your interests. All seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know his proven character, because he has served with me in the gospel ministry like a son with a father. Therefore, I hope to send him as soon as I see how things go with me. I am confident in the Lord that I myself will also come soon. But I considered it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, as well as your messenger and minister to my need. Since he has been longing for all of you and was distressed because you heard that he was sick. Indeed, he was so sick that he nearly died. However, God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, so that I would not have sorrow upon sorrow. For this reason, I am very eager to send him, so that you may rejoice again when you see him, and I may be less anxious. Therefore, welcome him in the Lord with great joy, and hold people like him in honor, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up what was lacking in your ministry to me. So just to kick it off, somebody tell me what's happening in this section of the text. Why Paul has just kind of expounded on Jesus and called us to model him, his way of thinking. Why does he shift to just kind of talk about two guys and the way they've served him and a couple errands they went on?
Yeah, it's interesting because initially this passage seems like a little bit of a letdown after such a beautiful passage. This hymn about Jesus' humility and exaltation in verses 6 through 11. And then he moves on to these travel plans he has with Timothy and Epaphroditus. But I think at least one thing Paul is doing in this passage is he was holding up the humility of Jesus, and now he's looking at two co-workers in the gospel and saying, I see the humility of Jesus at work in these two men. And if you look down at verse 29, he says, welcome these people, hold people like him, speaking of Epaphroditus, in honor. So I think really Paul is practicing what he's teaching here of saying, hold people up in honor. Even mundane servants like Epaphroditus, we don't hear too much about him in the rest of the New Testament. But he's saying, I see the humility and the glory of Jesus in this man as he lives out the story of Jesus in his particular life.
Anything else? What?
Well, I think that some of it is, in this earlier passage, verses 12 to 13, he's, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you. There's a sense in which you could read that individualistically. God works in me. Mm-hmm. We know that this is about a community. And so he's, in effect, changing mode from a theological statement about the church or about the community of faith, and then saying, God is at work in you, and how do I respond to that with appropriate honor? I don't discard other people because God's only working in me, and I'm working this out. He's working among us, and here's how I respond to that in honoring what God's doing in other people.
That's good.
And I think functionally as well, I think there's some speculation in the commentaries that Timothy was kind of like their favorite speaker. And so a part of the subtext for the letter itself is that Paul needed Timothy there with him to continue doing work. And so he sends Epaphroditus back. And I mean, I know we all love each other, but I think that they could have been a little let down by Epaphroditus coming down and not Paul or Timothy. So there's a sense in which Paul's trying to level the playing field and say, no, like God's working in Epaphroditus in the same way he's working in Timothy, in the same way he's working in me,
Yeah, that's good.
the same way he's working in you. So let's respond accordingly rather than playing favorites. There's a bit of some speculation, but I think there's reason to think that that's behind some of this.
That's good. Tell real quick on that note, who is Timothy and Epaphroditus? If you don't know, why are these two guys? What's their story, connection to Paul? What do we know about them in the rest of the Bible?
Don?
Well, we have in this text Timothy being a really close companion of Paul and someone Paul deeply loves and has been a good partner to Timothy. And then we also have Epaphroditus, who, like Elliot, I think, said, we don't really know much about him. He was sent by the church in Philippi to inquire about Paul, it seems. But beyond that, we just don't know that much. So one is relatively known, one is relatively unknown to who he is.
Do we think that Epaphroditus potentially was the one that delivered the letter? Is that right?
Yeah, I think the timeline of events is, in a sense, Paul planted the church. He moves on with Timothy. Epaphroditus was likely like one of the early leaders or pastors of the church. They somehow hear about Paul being imprisoned and in need, so they send Epaphroditus with a financial gift to support Paul, even though he didn't ask for it, which he says that elsewhere, where like, I wasn't trying to get this from you. And then along the way, Epaphroditus gets sick. That's what he literally says in this. Indeed, he was near to the point of death, verse 27. Recovers from that, delivers the gift, and Paul sends him back with this letter. So that's kind of the timeline of events of how this comes about.
And I think one thing, just stepping back before we move on to the next question, is like the broader context of Paul being in jail, and people are preaching out of selfish ambition. Like, Paul has left a gap, and now I can take his place and become prominent in the church. But Paul doesn't like play into that, and instead he goes on the offensive with honor. And I think that's just such a good takeaway from this passage of like the antidote to envy is actively honoring people and not kind of closing in and trying to gain power for yourself, but actively honoring the Christ you see in other people.
That's powerful, I think, because I think oftentimes I think about the antidote to envy is just to try to not be envious, to try to just stop doing that thing, rather than like maybe the antidote to my envy is to actually call out the good in what I see in other people, to honor them for who they are, to put myself in that place where I can allow myself to be changed, to set down my selfish ambition for the benefit of another.
We were going to hit this later, but since you brought up honor, I think it's worth thinking about a little bit. It seems pretty clear that Paul is leaning into honor. He'll say to the Romans, outdo one another in showing honor. Honor obviously isn't just flattery, right? Honor isn't just a compliment. I think the easiest way to describe it is like pointing out the Jesus you see in someone. I think we'd all want that kind of culture in our church. How do we go about creating a culture of honor like this in our church? Are there any practical things you're already seeing or people are doing or that we need to do better as a body? And why is it even important that we do this? I mean, you kind of answered it in that question, but would you say anything else about that?
Yeah, I think on the how, it could be as simple as a text or a call of just pointing out particular, especially the more particular you are on like an example of how people have been Christ-like. That's encouraging. But even especially face-to-face, like on a Sunday gathering, I think it's like taking a page out of Paul's book. He's using the technology of the day. He's sending letters, but he really wants to see them face-to-face. And that seems to matter to the apostles. So there's just nothing like it, maybe before or after service, someone coming up to you and saying, like, I see you like working really hard in this area of life, this hidden ministry that no one really sees. And I just want to honor you for that.
Does it have to be spiritual stuff? Like in the church?
Not at all. I mean, and I think like Epaphroditus, he did such a common thing. Like he basically brought Paul a care package. And we could just look at that as a very little thing that he did, but Paul actually revalues that, saying like you're a coworker, and we'll get into those things.
Mm-hmm.
But he highlights a very a physical act of service.
I think we have to acknowledge too that in a culture that's really good at criticism, that this is going to feel weird.
Yeah.
Like it's like when you go to the gym for the first time in forever, and I'm really good at going to the gym, stopping and going
The first
to the gym. So like I rediscover the same muscles over and over and over again, but it's similar in that way where you're gonna actually like, oh, this is gonna take a little work before it feels natural to do, to honor other people or call out good that we see in them, to be like Paul in this way.
It does feel like Paul modeling doing nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but sharing his own glory per se with faithful men or people in the body that are helping advance the gospel. Okay, let's switch gears a little. How do you see? I want to connect this because it's a letter, right? We want Paul's got a thought process. How do you see Timothy and or Epaphroditus kind of modeling obedience to verses 1 through 18? That Paul said, hey, this is what it looks like. We want to live our lives worthy of Jesus. We want to walk in unity and humility together. And by the way, Jesus is our example of doing that. So adopt that mind. How do you think that's part of what Paul's wanting to do in honoring these men?
I mean, it seems like one of the encouraging parts to me about this passage is the fact that, like, Paul has first set up Jesus as this ideal, someone to aspire to, like, his virtue and the way that he laid himself down. And that's great. That's Jesus. I'm not Jesus. And then, Paul's also a really good example, but Paul is an apostle. He got visited by Jesus on the road to Damascus, saw a bright light, all that stuff. Didn't happen to me. Timothy, he's a bit more well-known, but Epaphroditus is kind of a relative nobody other than he's mentioned twice here. And I think Paul is showing that this is not just something for like the spiritual elites. This isn't something for the upper echelons of Christendom. This is for the everyday people you've never heard of. And I think Paul is helpfully saying that, like, God gave them power to be this way, and he can give us the same power to be that way too. Most of us will be like Epaphroditus. Most people will not know who we are a couple generations after we die. But we can still live a life that matters, pleases God, and glorifies him. And demonstrates the humility of Jesus to the world and to other Christians.
Anything else you'd add?
Can you restate your question, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, do you think Paul in any way is trying to uplift and honor these guys as men who are modeling obedience to adopting the same mind of Jesus and doing nothing with selfish ambition or conceit?
So I think some of it is, at least the way I hear it, obedience is a very kind of off-putting word to the modern ear, I think. Tends to come with notions of kind of authoritarian, kind of top-down,
Shut up
do
and
what I
listen kind of
say,
thing.
that sort of thing, yeah. Very kind of rigid military kind of pyramid structure. I think it's interesting, but I think that it's a good word to use. It's just it takes us some time to kind of get around what it means, because then it's also just an odd phrase to say, like, I think that you should obey pastors, so to speak.
Sure.
Like that word, danger, Will Robinson.
Absolutely.
This just to kind of make a comment about the word obedience, I think that probably opens us into some of what's going on in this passage. The word obedience comes from the Latin word obedie, which is to listen or hear. And so through this chapter, we see Paul, I mean, if we take the hymn about Jesus to be written by the church prior to Paul, and Paul's just kind of bringing this into his letter, we have kind of this pattern of what we're called to do in the word obedience, of listening to who Jesus is, listening to the witness of who Jesus is, not just about the church, but God's voice himself, about what he says about Jesus. And so then as we again get to verses 12 and 13, work out your salvation in fear and trembling, recognizing that God is working to speak about who Jesus is in the literal words of the Bible, but also in the words and life of those around us. And so when we obey, we are listening to God's voice as it reverberates or refracts from the people around us. And I think that's a better kind of placing of obedience, so that it's not do what I say, but I think it's a wise nuance of, as you hear the voice of God in our conversation and in our relationship, then listen to that. Submit. I mean, I realize those are kind of odd words to a democratic context, but submission in a, I want this life for me, receive this life from you.
Yeah.
I want that sort of relational experience of God with you. And so then disobedience, to kind of flip the question, becomes more about, you didn't do what I said. It's not that. It's more about, well, I'm really sorry that you're not listening to the voice of God.
Right.
So I think that clarifies what we're talking about. Like when, the voice of God as it is in Scripture, the voice of God as it is in creation, whatever that God's voice is in those kind of realms.
Yeah.
Disobedience then becomes not about me personally. It then becomes, again, about the voice and presence of God himself.
And I would you say like a fair summary of Paul kind of encapsulating that thought is like, follow me as I follow Jesus? Like to the extent as pastors saying, go this way, go that way as long as it's reflecting Jesus, the way Jesus would take you, the path that Jesus has already put you on. Would you think that?
Yeah, and I think that to your question earlier, like how do we honor people? I think recognizing that in his book Life Together, Bonhoeffer talks about it is sheer grace and only grace that brings the church together. And so any experience of Jesus that we find in other people is not something that we are deserving of, but we are gifted. And so when we're called to honor other people, it's a grace to see Jesus in other people. And then we're in a sense kind of magnifying the work that God's already doing, that he wants us to participate in, by seeing what is there by grace with the eyes that we've got by grace, to then reflect it back. It becomes this kind of echoing experience.
Yeah. I think a really practical way, I mean, if I'm modeling a Savior who didn't grasp for power and even comfort, but emptied himself, here's Epaphroditus willing to die just to encourage Paul and just to bring him a care package.
Yeah, bro, I love you, but I ain't.
I know.
Yeah,
I already have enough problems going past the toll booth.
Right.
That's already a reach for me. So
yeah, he's not going to crawl to where to deliver a Dunkin' gift card.
Especially when he got sick halfway there.
Yeah.
And he's like, I got to go back home.
Yeah. And I think it's amazing, too, to see the lack of grumbling in verses 19 through 30 with all the change plans, all the sickness and disappointment. That connects it back to what Paul was saying. Just like they're joyfully doing this, caring for one another, sacrificing.
You said change plans, and I know, Don, that's something that you brought up in our sermon collab. How do you see this passage kind of speaking to how we faithfully follow Jesus when life doesn't go our way, when plans take us down a different road than what we were hoping they would? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that just stuck out to me was the simple fact that it seems like none of these guys are in an ideal sort of predicament. Paul's in prison. Epaphroditus is severely travel delayed because he got sick. Timothy, he seems like, I don't know what's going on with him, but it's not his ideal situation either. He's comforting Paul. And yet they keep going. And I think that, we all have experienced those points in life where, this isn't the life that I would have imagined, or this isn't going exactly how I would have wanted it to go. And I think that Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Paul in this case show us that faithfulness really is possible. That you can still adopt the same attitude as that of Christ Jesus, and still hold on to the fact that that one day every knee will bow in heaven and on earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So I think that they kind of encourage me that faithfulness is possible, and just to keep going whenever life isn't what I thought it was going to be, or this isn't the script I would have written for myself, or this is a hard hand. Paul's in jail. Epaphroditus got deathly ill, and they still kept following Jesus in their lives.
Yeah, that's really good.
I think that some of it as well is, again, back to the verse 12 and 13 of God is work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you. I think that it's not just going forward just because,
it's not rosy optimism, right?
In a sense, Paul's reframing the Christian life of, you don't have to have a plan with all the steps laid out, and God kind of, checks off on that. It's as life unfolds, you discover where God is working. And so it may be that God is working in the difficult circumstance that is in fact the invitation to a new experience of God that you hadn't scripted out, because frankly, we'd like to script things out that avoid difficulty and suffering.
And even through whatever that is, he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion.
Yeah, in a weird way, the disappointments and all that framing of it is, your call is to simply steward God's life where you are, not to dictate what God must do.
Yeah.
Which feels more in line with the wisdom of Proverbs and the Psalms and Ecclesiastes, rather than kind of here's my business plan for the Christian life.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because on a small scale, the neurovirus is ravaging our area. Somebody watching this got kids homesick, or a spouse homesick, or bigger
if
scale.
You notice my voice is not doing great. I don't have the neurovirus.
We wouldn't be here if you did.
I've got something that I'm long since past the contagious period, just to be clear. But
But I think then on a grander scale, someone in your family dies, or you lost a job, or God calls you to something you never anticipated in your life. And I do see this as a way to say, me dictating my plans to God is not the ultimate goal here, and God coming through. It's that whatever hand a good God deals me, I can serve him with joy and be faithful there. And even in the mundaneness, Paul's going to honor Epaphroditus as someone as a co-laborer in the gospel. And I think that's really encouraging to me, that as I follow Jesus faithfully in whatever task, role, season of life, that there's a way that I'm actually partnering in the work of the gospel in some way.
And I think that gets at back to the honor and the community piece of this. I think that's one of the reasons why we need to do that, because we, in the middle of those hard seasons, trusting that God can meet you in those hard seasons needs to be coupled with the community of faith saying hey, I see God working in you in this way. I see this in you. God has not forgotten you, calling out the good things and helping us shine like stars in the universe.
Yeah, that's great. We've kind of hit all the questions I have. Does anybody have any kind of closing thoughts or another kind of nugget for us that they want to throw out there?
I think as we are able to identify with gratitude what God is doing in other people, I think that's the pave markers. Those are the steps, so to speak, of honoring. Because I just think honor is a weird word.
Sure.
We
don't use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if you were to say, Jacob, I honor you, I'd be like, dude, you need to go, get checked out like this.
I honor you.
Yeah, thanks. But it's like, I think we live in a culture that has a scarcity mentality about resources.
Totally.
I mean, from large scale to the local dynamics, everybody's kind of operating on this scarcity mindset. And when we live with a gratitude orientation towards where is God at work in other people, and then speaking to that, we become a gracious community that is a giving community rather than a scarcity kind of how do we hold on to, so that we can say, like, I don't have to defend myself or kind of pump up my resume to validate my presence at the church or a part of the community. In fact, the other way is I want other people to feel like they are valued and welcomed. And so when I do that, in a sense, I'm basically kind of becoming a Sherlock Holmes for God's activity in the church. And so, okay, and not to be weird about it, but just to be like, man, I'm sure there's ways that we all have experienced God's kindness through other people in our community. And I think giving voice to it is the completion of that cycle. Because if we just keep it inside, well, they're not encouraged, and I'm just kind of talking to myself. Like, I don't know, neither of which are good options. So when we say or voice, here's where I see God working in you, here's what I'm grateful for, we are, I think, building this type of community that Paul's talking about.
And even the way that would just kind of organically guard unity. Like if I'm paying attention to anyone outside my own little, as Paul Tripp says, universe of one, right? So I'm, all of a sudden that helps, that it's not just about me. But then, like, I am believing the best about you, and I actually see Jesus at work in you. And I say it, and so then when you do something that a different doctrine or whatever, right?
Sure.
It's just fighting against that culture of suspicion and arguing and complaining that he's already talked about, and how in an organic way it really is guarding unity. And if I'm pointing out the Jesus I see in you, I think it simultaneously helps you believe that I'm for you, that I'm not against you, that we are in this together, and it's keeping the mission at the forefront and not just my own little preferences or my own little niche doctrine or whatever. And I don't know that that's Paul's intent, but I do think it accomplishes that. You think about the guy who's delivering this letter, and he gets a major shout out from Paul. Like, that had to make him just a little bit,
right.
and what that did for him among his own people. I think it's pretty cool.
And the type of thing that Paul calls out is, if Paul never mentioned what Epaphroditus went through to bring them that gift, we would have never heard of it.
Yeah.
So it's not just the speaking gifts that up front, but it's the hidden caring for an ailing parent, or cleaning up puke of a kid who's sick.
It could be making coffee for your friends.
It could be that was an 8-step process from farm to table.
I don't know who made the coffee, but it was really well made.
It was so good, and I honor whoever made it. One thought though on even taking this culture of honor like outside the church, with my PE teaching and also like coaching my son's basketball team, we just call it shout outs. And at the end of every game, looking for something to shout out another teammate. And just seeing that's an opportunity to love our neighbors, to honor the image of God in them. Whether it's a kid diving for a loose ball or helping a teammate up. And I remember just, there's a couple games I forgot to do shout outs, and the kids were asking to do that because they're so hungry to just be honored and seen and recognized for that. So that's a wonderful way to do that in our communities of creating this culture.
Yeah. And it does seem like Paul's honoring not necessarily the good thing that Epaphroditus does, but he's honoring the sharing and the suffering of the gospel, which he's already called us to do, right? And it's not like, hey, he showed up and preached this amazing sermon and the whole jail got saved. He honored that he was willing to endure suffering to encourage Paul and bring him whatever gift he needed to stay alive, so the gospel went forward. Okay, that's good. I think that's probably our time. I hope you were encouraged by this, and I hope that this will be the last service we have to cancel. But yeah, anything else for just a goodbye? Okay, we love you guys. Grace and peace, and we will see you next Sunday.